Welcome to our social studies lesson this week. We will be talking about the triangular trade route. All right, so let's talk about what the triangular trade route was. So it was named this. It was the trade routes between Africa, Europe, and the Americas during the slave trade. So it created this triangle shape as goods were being shipped to these different countries. So it kind of went in a triangle pattern.
A big concept in early American history was something called triangular trade, which of course had a little bit to do with the triangle. So you see, colonial America traded goods with Europe, which traded with West Africa, which traded with colonial America, and thus you've got the triangle. And let's see if we can, fit a little bit. There we go. So let's start with colonial America. They traded things to Europe called raw materials, which included sugar, tobacco, lumber, fish oil, and so on. Now, in return, Europe would send finished products back to America, which included furniture and cloth, guns, and so on. They would also trade these things with West Africans in exchange for slaves, whom they would ship to the Americas, thus a triangle. Now, sometimes slaves were sent to the West Indies to work on the sugar plantations, and then the sugar would be sent up to the American colonies to make, among other things, rum. And the rum would be shipped to West Africa in exchange for more slaves, and that's another triangle. So, let's review. You've got colonial America trading with Europe, trading with West Africa, trading with the West Indies, and back and forth, and they trade across the Atlantic Ocean, and all of these triangle shapes just start popping up all over the place. Thus, triangle trade.
Created using Powtoon.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that video. We will get our PowerPoint back up. Here we go. All right. So we have been talking about these countries
One of the harder
whose
things in life is
explorers.
making decisions when none of your options is especially great.
There we go. Cool. All right, so we have been talking in social studies about how different countries or explorers were coming over and creating settlements in the United States and other places. People were exploring all over the world now. And these people started realizing that they wanted or needed slaves to work on their plantations in places like South America, in the Caribbean, and in North America. North America is where you live. That is our continent. We live in North America. So these explorers or settlers decided, hey, we want people to work in our fields, in our plantations, to do the work for us. So we're going to talk about England, or the English colonies, and we've already discussed the 13 English colonies. So in the beginning, only a few slaves came to the English colonies. It wasn't a huge influx of slaves coming in, like hundreds of thousands of slaves. It was only a few at a time. But then tobacco plantations started popping up, and cotton plantations and rice plantations, and they were getting more popular. They decided they needed more people. So when I say England, and if I say Great Britain, I'm talking about the same place, okay? England, Great Britain, same thing. So, because the English owned more of North America than any other country, so remember we had the 13 colonies, the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies, who all belonged to England or Great Britain. They owned the most, so they had more power than anyone else. If you remember way back, we talked about more land equals more power. So Britain was given control over how the slave trade was working. So you see this word down here at the bottom that says a monopoly. A monopoly means they have control over it. Kind of like the game Monopoly. You're trying to own the most things, the most places, the airports, the hotels, and all that in the game of Monopoly. So Britain owned most of the slave trade. So they had a monopoly. Here is a map of the triangular trade. You see that Europeans would take different items, so pots, pans, guns, even alcohol and horses and other stuff, even more than that, all the way to Africa. And then the Europeans would then take slaves. So that's how they paid for slaves. They would transport them to the Americas. And then the Europeans would take sugar, cotton, rum, tobacco, and coffee back to Europe. So it was a big trade. So they paid for the slaves with different items. So they were saying that these people could be bought with items or with money. And they were trading across continents. So Europe, Africa, and then the Americas. Here's just another picture for you. And I want you to notice this word right here, these two words right here. Middle Passage. That's going to come up again in just a little bit. So this is just showing the routes that some of these things were going. So from the Americas, there were things like tobacco, cotton, sugar. Things from Europe would go, or manufactured goods from Europe would go to Africa. And then the slaves would then go back to the Americas. Here's just another picture. I want you to notice these dates down here. 1440 to 1867. That's 400 years of this going on, of this triangular trade going on. Now, slavery lasted even longer than 1867, as we'll see when we talk later on about when we continue on in our conversation of slavery. But just we're talking about the triangular trade, the slave trade happened during these 400 years. That is crazy to me. 400 years of this going on. 400 years. I just can't wrap my mind around it. All right, so leg one. So we're going to talk about where it started, where the tip of the triangle started. So we're talking about the outward passage. So ships would be in Europe, boats. They would load up those European ships with things like guns, tools, textiles, and a textile is like fabric, and other stuff, as we saw, like pots and pans and things like that. They would load them onto the ships in Europe. Then they would sail to Africa. And those crews on the ships would go ashore with their guns and capture slaves and then purchase slaves from the African tribe leaders. So there were different ways that they were able to capture the slaves. They would kidnap them. They would trade them. The tribal leaders would give them as gifts. People in debt, criminals, prisoners of war. There was all kind of ways that they went about getting these slaves. So they would go through whatever it took in order to get those slaves. Absolutely ridiculous. All right, so we're going to talk about a gory or a slave stick. So what this was is a forked branch. So you can see it right here. It kind of looks like a fork. And it opens exactly to the size of a neck, so a head cannot pass through it. The fork has a little piece right here, if you can see my pointer right here, so that the slave cannot get their head through it. So this is how they would kind of control them. So they couldn't get so it was kind of like a leash, like an old-timey leash, just made out of wood for these slaves. And that's how they would carry them back onto, one of the ways that they would carry them back and get them onto their ships. It is inhumane. It's absolutely inhumane. That's how you would treat a wild animal. And that's how they treated these people, and it is very sad. So here's some pictures of what some different, gory or slave sticks might look like. So here's a really big one right here. So they were trying to make it where this gentleman could not escape. And here's just a drawing of some examples of what they could look like. So they may even have two people together. Here were just some pictures, some drawings, illustrations. Excuse me, we learned what illustrations were. These were just drawings of what it might have looked like to get these slaves to the ships. And you can see that they're not nice conditions. I'm going to leave it here for a few minutes so you can kind of look at that. And I want you to notice this person right here. It looks like this person is trying to fight back, but whoever this is, harming them. All right, so now we have what's called forced participation. So in Africa, they had chiefs at this time. They had tribes and chiefs. So at first, the chiefs resisted. They said, you are not taking our people. These are our people. You can't take them to be slaves. But they needed weapons. And they didn't have weapons, these African tribe leaders, these chiefs. And the Europeans did, and they were just too powerful for them. So their resistance was not successful. They were taken over by the Europeans because the Europeans had guns, and the African tribal leaders, the African tribes, did not have guns. So if the chiefs refused to supply the slaves, they were threatened to be taken as slaves themselves. So the Europeans would threaten them to they said, well, if you're not going to give up somebody, we'll just take you instead. And so this picture up here is just another type of restraint that they would use. Here are some pictures. They're not easy things to see. It's not something that American history is. It was not a proud moment in American history at all. All right. Slaves were held in prisons along the west coast of Africa, and they were waiting to be put on slave ships. So they were kept in prisons until another ship would come and load them up. So some were not able to be on the ship because they may have gotten sick, because they weren't taking prisoners just from the shores. They would travel deep. These Europeans would travel deep, far into Africa, and have to make days and weeks trips into the middle of Africa in order to get these slaves. So these were long journeys. It didn't just take a day to get them. So by the time they finally got to the shore, some of these people were sick because they were treating them like wild animals. Well, they were treating them worse than wild animals. And so if a European decided that this slave is not good enough, they're too sick, they would just leave them there to die. They wouldn't take them with them. They would just leave them. All right, so that is the first part of the passage. Now we're on to the second leg of the passage, the middle passage. This was the worst part of the passage. This was the worst part of the triangular trade. This was the voyage from Africa to the Americas. So this is when the slaves were on the ship on their way to be slaves for the Americans. So the ships would sail across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas carrying slaves and gold. The journey took about 5 to 12 weeks. That's over a month that it took these ships to arrive from Africa to the Americas. And it was absolutely disgusting conditions. You got to think, these ships were not like cruise ships today. They didn't have running water and bathrooms and awesome buffets, and these were just generic wooden ships that did not have all of the luxuries that ships today have. Some Africans tried to jump off. A lot of them refused to eat, and they would rebel. They were like, this is not right. I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. But the loss of a slave's life was a loss of money because they had already paid for these slaves. So if the slaves jumped ship, they paid for nothing, is what their thoughts were. So here are just some more pictures. And you can see the slaves kind of starting to fight back in this picture up here to the right. And even here in this top left picture, you can see some slaves trying to fight back. And you can see some slaves down here in the bottom picture trying to jump ship. All right, so here's more of the Middle Passage. So there were two ways that these slaves, these people, were packed into the ships. One way was called loose packing, and captains took fewer slaves, so they would take not as many in order, they thought that they were going to reduce the amount of sickness. They said if there's less people, then less of them are going to get sick because there's not as many people on the boat. And then there would be tight packing, where captains of ships would carry as many ships as many slaves, as many people, as the ship could hold. They did not care how many. They didn't care if they were shoulder to shoulder. And many of those people died on the voyage because the sickness spread so fast. And we can kind of think of that like COVID right now. We talk about social distancing and how we're trying to keep the virus from spreading. And we're trying to do that by not keeping as many people together at once. And so that's what these horrible captains would do, is that they would try to keep these African people either loose because they wanted to get them to their destination without getting sick, or they wanted to get as many as they could over there and didn't care if they got sick. So these are some pictures of how these slaves may be packed in a ship. So they may be laying like this to fit in where there's no room. They may be sitting with no room to lay down here, like in the second picture. And then they were packed in the bottom or middle part of the ship where they couldn't stand. I'll let you look at that for just a minute. Here's another depiction of just the amount of people that these awful, horrible people would pack into their ships. Just the amount. It's absolutely devastating. It's terrible. Here is just an idea or some drawings, some illustrations of some restraints or shackles that may be placed onto these slaves. So they had ones for their feet, ones for their hands. Here's just another illustration of what may happen. Now this was not a real picture. This was one that was recreated by people. So this was not a real picture. This was recreated by some people, but this may be a way that African people were packed in ships as well, in wooden boards stacked up like they were just boxes of mashed potatoes or something. It's just sad, and I can't wrap my mind around it, really. All right, so now we're on to the third leg, the last leg of the triangular trade, the homeward passage. So once these ships got to the Americas, Africans were sold in auctions. The money from the sale would buy cargo for the ships like cotton, sugar, spices, rum, chocolate, tobacco, all kind of things. And then Europe would convert these raw materials like cotton, sugar, spices, and all that into the finished product. So they needed those in order to create their manufactured items in Europe. And then it would just keep going around and keep going around. So here are some pictures of what an auction may look like. They would have these African people stand up on like a stage and be sold. All right, so let's talk about the auctions. And there were 3 types of ways that slaves were auctioned off. The first way were public auctions. They would put tar on the slaves to hide any type of sore or cut that they had. So just to make it look like they were more healthy. The slaves were inspected. And an auction took place where the highest bidder would get to purchase the slave. So let's say person A said, I'll pay $30 for this slave, but then person B says, well, I'll pay $65. So the person who offered the most money would get to win the slave. Slaves were branded, and what that is, and I'll show you a brand on the next page, where a piece of metal would be stuck into a fire, and they would be pushed into their skin. So they would be branded. It would say, you belong to me. So a lot of times it would have the slave master's initials on them, so they knew who they belonged to. This happens to animals, guys. Families were separated, so a slave may not stay with their family. More often than not, they did not get to stay with their family. And then they were given the name of the slave owner. They did not get to keep their born name. They had to take the name of the slave owner. So up here, the top were some examples of some brands. So these pieces would be, the end of this, the tops would be stuck into fire to where they would get really, 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 really super hot. And then they would press them really hard into the skin to brand these people, and that it never ever comes off. And here is just a flyer for slaves, just telling about a public auction. All right, the second type of auction were private auctions. The first was public. They were similar to public auctions, except they were indoors, and then red markers would be placed on the door to indicate that an auction was going on. So pretty much you had to basically buy a ticket. People would have to buy a ticket in order to get in. So the public auctions, they were a lot of times held in the street or in the public square, and anybody could just watch. But a private auction was held indoors in some type of a building, and not everybody could participate. It was just another way for these money-hungry people to make money. So here would be kind of like an indoor auction, a private auction. You see they're indoors somewhere and there's not as many people. And the last type of auctions were called a scramble. This is where they would take place, the auction would take place on the dock or the deck of the ship. So as soon as, sometimes they didn't even get off the ship before they were sold. Slave owners would, so the captains would say, all right, this slave is $55 or however much it was, however much the person that they decided how much they were worth. They would have a price on them, like a price tag, like an item, like nothing. And then the slave owners would get to go in and basically shop for who they wanted. They were shopping. So they treated these people like objects. Absolutely terrible. All right, so American-born slaves who had more skills were the most expensive. African-born slaves, so the ones that they brought over from Africa, were worth less money because they had to be broken in, because they had been in Africa and they knew the African ways. And so they had to basically be what these slave owners called broken in and broken of their ways. They needed to learn the American way. So they were less expensive. The age that a slave was, whether they were a boy or a girl, and what skills they had determined how much they would be. If you had more skills, you would be more expensive. Or a slave, if they had more skills, they would be more expensive. Slaves with many scars on them were considered to be too rebellious. So what these slave owners thought were, oh, they have scars because they were trying to fight and get away. And so the captains had to harm them in order to get them to stop. So a lot of people wouldn't like slaves that had the scars on them because they thought they had already tried to escape and they didn't want them to escape from their plantation. So remember, the three ways were a public auction, a private auction, or a scramble, the one that happened on the ship or on the dock of the ship where they got to go basically shopping. So here is a flyer. And that is our social studies lesson. I know it's a difficult topic to talk about, and so I wanted to record this lesson so that you could pause it if you needed to. So when you are finished listening, make sure you go and do your social studies assignment, pages 120 and 127 for this week. See you guys later.